In a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where lawns were perfectly manicured and mailboxes stood in neat rows, Mark Davidson lived a simple life. He wasn't flashy or loud, just an ordinary guy trying to raise his spirited 8-year-old daughter, Lily, while keeping up with the demands of being a single dad. To most people in the area, he seemed like any other homeowner, someone who mowed his lawn on weekends, waved politely at neighbors, and occasionally forgot to bring in the trash cans before heading off to work. But beneath this unassuming exterior lay years of experience that no one could have guessed. Mark's past was anything but ordinary. Before settling into suburban life, he had spent over a decade training elite special forces operatives. His expertise, stealth tactics, reconnaissance, psychological warfare, and dismantling hostile organizations without leaving a trace. It was a world far removed from the humdrum routines of homeowners association, HOA meetings, and backyard barbecues. Yet here he was now, retired from active duty, pouring all his energy into raising Lily. For Mark, nothing mattered more than her happiness and safety. She was his entire universe, a bright, curious little girl whose laughter filled their modest home and made even the toughest days feel lighter. Their house wasn't the fanciest on the block, but it was cozy and full of warmth. The walls were decorated with colorful drawings Lily had made at school, and shelves overflowed with books, puzzles, and stuffed animals. Outside, their front porch often featured toys scattered around, a testament to Lily's boundless energy. Mark didn't mind the mess. It reminded him that his daughter felt free to be herself. What he didn't realize, however, was that these small details would soon become ammunition for a much larger conflict. The trouble began subtly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it started with letters slipped under the door, formal notices, from the neighborhood HOA reminding residents about rules they might have overlooked. These weren't unusual occurrences in gated communities like theirs. People expected reminders about things like mailbox colors, holiday decorations, and lawn maintenance schedules. Mark skimmed through them, nodding along to requests like trimming, hedges, or repainting fences. None of it seemed particularly urgent or unreasonable. But then came the complaints. One afternoon, as Mark returned home from dropping Lily off at soccer practice, he found a notice taped to his front door. "Violation of property standards," it read. Apparently, leaving Lily's dolls and jump ropes on the porch constituted a breach of community guidelines. Mark chuckled at the absurdity of it. Surely no one cared that much about a few toys. He shrugged it off, assuming it was just another case of overly zealous rule enforcement. However, the HOA didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, more notices arrived, each one escalating in tone. A misplaced garden hose earned him a warning about safety hazards. An overgrown patch of grass near the driveway became a grievance labeled unsightly neglect. Even the color of his welcome mat drew criticism. It clashed with the approved palette outlined in the HOA handbook, apparently. Mark tried to comply wherever possible, reasoning that avoiding unnecessary drama was better for everyone involved. Still, the frequency and pettiness of the complaints left him feeling uneasy. What truly set alarm bells ringing, though, was the attitude of the HOA president, Richard. A slick, self-assured man in his late 50s, Richard chaired every meeting with an air of superiority that rubbed many residents the wrong way. He spoke in clipped sentences, rarely smiled, and always insisted that the HOA existed solely for the good of the community. While some neighbors admired his dedication, others whispered about his iron-fisted approach behind closed doors. During one particularly tense gathering, Mark found himself face-to-face with Richard after questioning the fairness of certain fines imposed on residents. "You seem to take these rules very seriously," Mark remarked casually, attempting to lighten the mood. Richard's response was icy. "Rules keep order," he said, staring directly at Mark. "And those who can't follow them, well, let's just say they don't belong here." The comment lingered in Mark's mind long after the meeting ended. Was Richard merely posturing, or did he genuinely mean what he said? Either way, Mark decided not to dwell on it. After all, what harm could a group of neighbors enforcing minor regulations possibly do? That illusion of innocence shattered when Mark received a handwritten letter delivered personally to his door. The envelope bore no official stamp or logo, which struck him as odd. Inside, the message was brief, but chilling. Your child's welfare is at risk due to your failure to maintain proper living conditions. Immediate action is required to ensure her safety. Beneath the text was a thinly veiled threat, hinting at potential legal consequences if Mark failed to address the alleged issues promptly. At first glance, the accusation seemed laughable. How could a few toys on the porch or slightly uneven grass endanger anyone, let alone a happy, healthy child like Lily? But as Mark reread the letter, a cold realization settled in. This wasn't just about nitpicking over trivial matters anymore. Someone, likely Richard, was deliberately targeting him using fear and intimidation to force compliance. Determined to understand what he was up against, Mark reached out to trusted friends within law enforcement circles. Through careful inquiries, he uncovered disturbing patterns linking Richard and his inner circle to a web of unethical behavior. It turned out that several families had quietly moved away after receiving similar threats from the HOA. Others stayed silent, too afraid to challenge the status quo. The HOA's power, Mark learned, stemmed not only from its rigid enforcement of rules, but also from its ability to manipulate local systems, including Child Protective Services, CPS. For Mark, this revelation was both infuriating and terrifying. He couldn't fathom how anyone could weaponize bureaucracy against innocent families. More importantly, he refused to let them use such tactics against Lily. As a father, and as someone trained to dismantle oppressive structures, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The battle lines were drawn, and Mark was ready to fight back. But unlike his adversaries, he wouldn't rely on fear or coercion. Instead, he would employ strategy, precision, and patience, the same skills that had once earned him respect among the world's most elite operatives. Little did the HOA know, their campaign against Mark Davidson was about to backfire spectacularly. The letter shook Mark to his core. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the calculated cruelty behind them. Someone had gone out of their way to make him feel powerless, to plant seeds of doubt and fear in his mind. The accusation that he was somehow failing Lily as a parent cut deep. He knew better than anyone how much he loved her, how hard he worked every day to give her a safe and happy life. But accusations like this weren't about truth, they were about control. And Mark understood that all too well. That night, after tucking Lily into bed and listening to her excited chatter about school and friends, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the ominous letter. His thoughts raced. Was this really happening? Could the HOA actually take his child away based on fabricated claims? The idea seemed absurd, but Mark knew better than to underestimate people who operated in shadows. He'd seen it before in his military career, how those with authority could twist systems to serve their own agendas. This wasn't just about rules or property standards anymore, it was personal. Determined to get answers, Mark reached out to a few trusted contacts. Over the years, he'd built a network of friends in law enforcement, private investigation, and even government oversight agencies. These were people who owed him favors or respected his expertise enough to listen when he called. One by one, he explained the situation without revealing too many details. "I need to know if there's any legitimacy to these threats," he told them. "Who's pulling the strings here?" What he uncovered chilled him to the bone. Through discreet conversations and careful digging, Mark pieced together a disturbing picture of Richard's operation. It turned out that the HOA president wasn't just an overzealous bureaucrat. He was the ringleader of a shadowy network designed to intimidate residents into compliance. Families who questioned the HOA's decisions often found themselves targeted, with baseless accusations, fines, and legal threats. Some caved under the pressure, paying exorbitant fees or moving away altogether. Others stayed silent, too afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. One particularly alarming revelation came from a former neighbor who had sold their home 2 years earlier. "They made our lives hell," the woman confessed during a phone call with Mark. "First it was little things, complaints about paint colors or parking violations. Then it got worse. They accused us of violating noise ordinances when we weren't even home. Eventually, they threatened to involve CPS because my husband worked late shifts and couldn't always be around for inspections. We couldn't take it anymore. Hearing stories like this only fueled Mark's resolve. He realized that standing up to Richard wouldn't be easy, but backing down wasn't an option either. If he let this slide, not only would his own family suffer, but other, innocent families might fall victim to the same tactics. For Mark, this fight wasn't just about protecting Lily. It was about exposing the corruption festering beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic neighborhood. As days passed, Mark began gathering evidence, drawing on skills honed during his time training Special Forces operatives. He approached the task methodically. Every interaction with the HOA became an opportunity to collect information. He attended meetings, taking detailed notes whenever Richard spoke. He photographed notices left on his door and documented every communication sent by the HOA. Even mundane conversations with neighbors provided valuable insights: who supported Richard, who feared him, and who might secretly oppose him. But Mark didn't stop there. Knowing that Richard likely kept records of his activities, Mark decided to dig deeper. Using encrypted messaging apps and burner phones, he reached out to a close friend who specialized in cybersecurity. Together, they devised a plan to infiltrate the HOA's digital footprint. Mark knew this was risky. If caught, he could face serious consequences, but the stakes were too high to play it safe. With his friend's guidance, he accessed emails, financial records, and internal communications shared among HOA members. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Richard had been forging documents to justify his actions. Fake inspection reports, falsified witness statements, and doctored photographs painted a picture of negligence where none existed. Worse still, he had connections within local government offices, including a corrupt CPS worker willing to fabricate cases against parents who defied him. It was a web of deceit so intricate that most people wouldn't have known where to start unraveling it. But Mark wasn't most people. Armed with this knowledge, Mark began crafting a counterattack. He knew confronting Richard directly would be reckless. The man thrived on chaos and conflict. Instead, Mark adopted a strategy rooted in subtlety and precision. His goal wasn't revenge, it was exposure. He wanted to dismantle Richard's empire piece by piece, exposing its rotten foundation until it collapsed under its own weight. To achieve this, Mark planted subtle traps. He deliberately allowed minor infractions to occur, like letting weeds grow slightly longer than usual or leaving toys on the porch overnight, to bait Richard into escalating his campaign. Each move gave Mark more ammunition to document the HOA's unethical practices. At the same, she continued coaching Lily, staying safe. Calm, assuring Daddy everything. Control. Mark also reached whistleblower contacts, feeding anonymized tips, investigative journalists, federal authorities. Simultaneously, he gathered courage neighbors, encouraging share experiences collectively, stand tyrannical regime. Though daunting task, initially hesitant families gradually warmed, realizing strength unity. By time, final phase plan, ready, execute. Mark assembled comprehensive dossier detailing Richard crimes, corruption, including forged documents, illegal payments, audio recordings, bragging, ruining lives, arsenal tools needed bring justice. While daunting journey ahead, confident preparation, diligence ultimately prevail. With meticulous planning, execution. Mark poised reclaim peace neighborhood, ensuring future generations grow. Environment free. Oppression. Intimidation. Little anticipated. Battle require skills honed decades. Service prove invaluable, restoring harmony. Suburban sanctuary. As the pieces of Richard's operation fell into place, Mark knew it was time to act, but not recklessly. He had spent years teaching elite operatives how to dismantle hostile organizations quietly and efficiently, and now those lessons would serve him well. This wasn't a battlefield in some far-off country. It was his home, his neighborhood, and most importantly, his daughter's world. Every move he made had to be precise, calculated, and untraceable. Failure wasn't an option. Mark began by transforming his modest house into a command center. The dining table became his workspace, cluttered with notebooks, printed emails, financial records, and maps of the neighborhood. A corkboard on the wall displayed photos of key HOA members, along with notes detailing their roles and connections. Lily noticed the change but didn't ask too many questions. "Daddy's working on something important," Mark told her with a reassuring smile. She trusted him completely, and that trust gave him even more motivation to succeed. Every evening, after Lily went to bed, Mark dove deeper into the evidence he'd gathered. The documents stolen from Richard's digital archives revealed a tangled web of corruption. Falsified inspection reports, forged letters sent to residents, and bank statements showing illegal payments exchanged between Richard and local officials. There were even audio recordings, captured through hacked conference calls, of Richard boasting about how easy it was to manipulate people who feared losing their homes or reputations. Listening to these recordings filled Mark with anger, but also clarity. He realized that Richard thrived on fear and chaos. To defeat him, Mark needed to turn those tools against him. But exposing the truth required more than just collecting evidence. It demanded strategy. Mark knew that simply handing over files to authorities might not be enough. Richard had friends in high places, and corrupt systems often protected themselves. Instead, Mark decided to orchestrate a multi-pronged attack, one that would leave Richard cornered and powerless. First, Mark reached out to his network of contacts again. This time he shared anonymized tips with investigative journalists and government oversight agencies. He used burner phones and encrypted apps to ensure his identity remained hidden. His messages contained just enough detail to pique interest without revealing his hand. For example, he alerted a journalist to suspicious transactions involving the HOA's funds, suggesting they dig deeper into Richard's financial dealings. Similarly, he tipped off federal regulators about potential collusion between the HOA and local officials. Each leak planted seeds of doubt, setting the stage for Richard's downfall. At the same time, Mark worked to build alliances within the community. He started small, striking up casual conversations with neighbors during morning walks or weekend errands. "Have you ever felt like the HOA goes too far?" he'd ask nonchalantly. At first, people hesitated to speak openly, afraid of retaliation. But Mark's calm demeanor and genuine concern put them at ease. Slowly, stories began to emerge. Stories of families bullied into compliance, fined unfairly, or forced to sell their homes under pressure. Some admitted they'd suspected foul play but never dared to challenge the system. Others expressed frustration but felt powerless to act. Encouraged by their willingness to share, Mark proposed a bold idea: collective action. "If we stand together, we can fight back," he said during one impromptu meeting in his living room. "They pick us off one by one because they know we're scared. But what if we weren't afraid anymore? What if we showed them that we won't back down?" His words resonated deeply. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began speaking up, sharing their experiences with each other and documenting everything. One couple even agreed to file a formal complaint with local authorities, using evidence provided by Mark. Another family offered to testify if needed, despite initial fears of reprisal. Together, they formed a loose coalition united by a common goal: to expose the HOA's corruption and reclaim their neighborhood. While rallying the community, Mark also prepared for the next phase of his plan: direct infiltration. He knew Richard stored physical copies of incriminating documents in the HOA clubhouse, a small building tucked away near the entrance of the subdivision. These files included original copies of forged reports, handwritten notes, and signed agreements with accomplices. If Mark could retrieve them, he'd have irrefutable proof of Richard's crimes. To pull this off, Mark relied on skills honed during his military career. He studied the clubhouse's layout using satellite imagery and observations made during previous HOA meetings. He noted the location of security cameras, motion sensors, and guard schedules. Then, he devised a plan to neutralize these obstacles quietly and efficiently. Timing was critical. He chose a moonless night when visibility would be low, minimizing the risk of detection. The night of the operation arrived, and Mark moved with precision. Dressed in black tactical gear, he slipped out of his house while Lily slept soundly upstairs. His heart pounded as he approached the clubhouse, every sense attuned to his surroundings. Using a handheld device to disable the security system temporarily, he entered through a side door undetected. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting eerie shadows across the room. Mark wasted no time. He navigated to the filing cabinet where Richard kept his records, working quickly but carefully. File after file revealed damning evidence: fake inspection reports, doctored photographs, and letters threatening residents with legal action. Mark copied everything onto encrypted drives, ensuring nothing could be traced back to him. Before leaving, he left behind harmless decoys, blank folders labeled with meaningless titles, to buy himself time before Richard discovered the breach. Back at home, Mark reviewed the newly acquired evidence. It was overwhelming but also empowering. With this arsenal of information, he could dismantle Richard's empire piece by piece. Yet Mark knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Exposing the truth meant stepping into the spotlight, risking backlash, not only from Richard but potentially from others complicit in his schemes. Still, Mark refused to waver. For Lily, for his neighbors, and for the future of their community, he was ready to see this through to the end. As dawn broke over the quiet neighborhood, Mark sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee and staring at the stack of files before him. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks he felt a glimmer of hope. Richard had underestimated him, and that mistake would cost him dearly. The night Mark infiltrated the HOA clubhouse marked a turning point in his battle against Richard and his network of corruption. With the stolen evidence safely stored in encrypted drives, Mark felt a surge of determination. He knew he had everything. He needed to expose Richard's crimes, but timing was crucial. Moving too quickly could tip off Richard and give him time to cover his tracks, while waiting too long risked losing momentum. Every decision mattered, and Mark approached the next phase with the same precision and discipline that had defined his military career. Mark's plan relied on creating chaos from within, disrupting Richard's operation quietly but effectively until it collapsed under its own weight. The first step was feeding carefully curated leaks to investigative journalists and government agencies. Using burner phones and encrypted messaging apps, Mark sent anonymized tips containing just enough information to spark interest without revealing his identity. For instance, he alerted a local newspaper to suspicious financial transactions involving the HOA's accounts, suggesting they investigate further. Similarly, he tipped off federal regulators about potential collusion between the HOA and local officials, pointing them toward specific individuals and documents. These leaks worked like dominoes, each one triggering a chain reaction. Within days, reporters began digging into the allegations, uncovering inconsistencies and red flags that pointed directly to Richard. Stories started appearing online and in print, raising questions about the HOA's legitimacy. One article highlighted how several families had been forced to sell their homes after receiving baseless threats from the HOA. Another exposed the cozy relationship between Richard and a corrupt CPS worker who had rubber-stamped false allegations against parents who dared to resist. As public scrutiny intensified, Richard grew increasingly agitated. At the next HOA meeting, he tried to downplay the accusations, dismissing them as baseless rumors spread by disgruntled residents. But his usual bravado rang hollow this time. Neighbors exchanged skeptical glances, whispering among themselves about the mounting evidence against him. Even some of Richard's closest allies began distancing themselves, sensing the tide was turning. Meanwhile, Mark continued to escalate his campaign behind the scenes. He planted subtle traps designed to bait Richard into making mistakes. Knowing that Richard thrived on intimidation, Mark deliberately allowed minor infractions to occur, like letting weeds grow slightly longer than usual or leaving Lily's toys scattered on the porch overnight. Each infraction drew predictable responses from Richard: angry letters, fines, and thinly veiled threats. But instead of backing down, Mark documented every interaction, building a paper trail that painted Richard as obsessive and vindictive. One evening, during a particularly heated exchange over text messages, Richard accused Mark of deliberately trying to provoke him. "You're playing games," Richard wrote, "but you'll regret crossing me." Mark smiled grimly at the screen. That was exactly what he wanted, to push Richard into overreacting publicly. The angrier Richard became, the more likely he was to slip up and reveal incriminating details. Mark also focused on rallying the community. His earlier efforts to unite neighbors had paid off. A small but growing group of residents now stood ready to testify about their experiences with the HOA. Some shared stories of being fined unfairly for trivial violations, while others recounted how Richard had bullied them into compliance. Together, they drafted a formal complaint detailing years of harassment and abuse of power. When the document was submitted to local authorities, it carried the weight of collective voices, a stark contrast to the isolated struggles many had endured alone. To amplify their message, Mark encouraged the group to speak out publicly. A few brave neighbors agreed to go on record with journalists, sharing their stories in interviews and social media posts. The response was overwhelming. Other residents came forward, emboldened by the courage of those who had already spoken up. What had once seemed like an insurmountable force, the iron grip of the HOA, was beginning to crack under the pressure of unity and transparency. Behind the scenes, Mark coordinated with his whistleblower contacts to ensure the investigation gained traction. He provided investigators with copies of the stolen documents, along with detailed explanations of their significance. The files included forged inspection reports, falsified witness statements, and audio recordings of Richard boasting about his tactics. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the case against him, leaving little room for denial. As the scandal unfolded, Richard's empire began to crumble. Local officials launched an inquiry into the HOA's practices, freezing its assets pending further review. The corrupt CPS worker implicated in the scheme lost her license permanently, after internal reviews confirmed her involvement in fabricating cases against parents. Meanwhile, federal regulators opened a separate investigation into potential bribery and fraud, widening the scope of the fallout. For Mark, watching the dominoes fall was both satisfying and surreal. He had spent weeks operating in secrecy, moving cautiously to avoid detection. Now the truth was out in the open, impossible to ignore. Reporters camped outside the HOA clubhouse, snapping photos and interviewing outraged residents. Social media buzzed with hashtags calling for accountability and reform. The quiet neighborhood Mark called home had become ground zero for a nationwide conversation about power, corruption, and justice. Yet despite the progress, Mark remained vigilant. He knew Richard wouldn't go down without a fight. True to form, Richard attempted to counterattack, accusing Mark of orchestrating a smear campaign fueled by personal vendettas. In press releases and hastily arranged interviews, he portrayed himself as a victim of lies and misinformation. But his defenses fell flat. Without credible evidence to support his claims, Richard's denials sounded desperate and hollow. The final blow came when authorities executed search warrants at the HOA clubhouse and Richard's personal residence. Investigators seized computers, phones, and filing cabinets filled with damning records. Among the discoveries were handwritten notes detailing illegal payments, contracts signed with accomplices, and emails outlining plans to target specific families. It was clear that Richard's operation had been meticulously planned and equally meticulously dismantled. By the time the dust settled, Richard and several key members of the HOA leadership faced multiple charges, including fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Their arrest sent shockwaves through the community, not because anyone doubted their guilt, but because it signaled the end of an era. For years, residents had lived under the shadow of fear, silenced by the threat of retaliation. Now, they could breathe freely again, knowing that justice had finally prevailed. Mark watched it all unfold with a mix of relief and pride. He hadn't sought recognition or glory. His only goal had been to protect Lily and restore peace to their neighborhood. Yet, as neighbors thanked him for standing up to tyranny, he realized the impact of his actions extended far beyond his family. He had shown them that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be dismantled with courage, strategy, and unity. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch watching Lily play with her friends, he reflected on everything they had been through. The lawn was still imperfect, the welcome mat still clashed with the approved color palette, and toys still littered the front steps. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the laughter filling the air, the smiles on children's faces, and the knowledge that their community belonged to them, not to someone wielding fear as a weapon. For Mark, the battle against the fake HOA wasn't just a victory for his family. It was a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. And though he hoped never to face such danger again, he knew that if the need arose, he would rise to the occasion once more. After all, he was more than just a dad protecting his kid. He was a man trained to destroy targets quietly, efficiently, and decisively. The aftermath of Richard's arrest brought a profound sense of relief to the neighborhood, but it also sparked a wave of reflection and change. What had once been a community ruled by fear was now beginning to heal, thanks in large part to Mark's quiet determination and strategic brilliance. The transformation wasn't immediate. Old habits die hard, but slowly, residents started reclaiming their streets, parks, and shared spaces. For Mark and Lily, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though it carried with it new layers of meaning. In the weeks following Richard's downfall, the HOA underwent a complete overhaul. Local authorities froze its assets pending an investigation, leaving the organization essentially defunct. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance from each other began reaching out, forming bonds that went beyond superficial pleasantries. Informal gatherings sprang up across the neighborhood: potluck dinners, weekend barbecues, and even impromptu game nights for the kids. People laughed together, shared stories, and celebrated their collective triumph over tyranny. It was as if a heavy fog had lifted, revealing the warmth and camaraderie that had always existed beneath the surface. Mark found himself at the center of this newfound unity, though he never sought the spotlight. Neighbors frequently stopped by his house to thank him for standing up to Richard. Some brought homemade casseroles or fresh-baked cookies. Others simply offered heartfelt words of gratitude. "You saved us," one elderly woman told him during a casual chat over coffee. "We were all too scared to say anything, but you showed us it could be done." Mark always downplayed his role, insisting that he'd only done what any parent would do to protect their child. "I'm just a dad looking out for my kid," he'd say with a modest smile. But deep down he knew the truth. His actions had inspired others to find their own courage. By taking on Richard and exposing the corruption, he had given them permission to believe they weren't powerless after all. For Lily, the changes in the neighborhood meant more than just seeing her father hailed as a hero. She noticed how neighbors treated her differently now, with kindness and respect. Kids who used to ignore her because of her troublemaker dad suddenly wanted to play with her. Parents smiled warmly when she passed by, no longer whispering behind closed doors about whether Mark was too much trouble. At school, teachers remarked on how confident and happy she seemed, unaware of the weight that had been lifted off her tiny shoulders. One afternoon, while playing hopscotch with her friends near the cul-de-sac, Lily proudly announced, "My dad is like a superhero." Her friends giggled, asking what kind of superpowers he had. "He can sneak into bad guys' hideouts without making a sound," she declared, mimicking stealthy movements with exaggerated tiptoes. The children erupted in laughter, imagining Mark as some comic book vigilante. Mark, watching from the porch, chuckled softly. If only they knew how close to reality their playful banter really was. Despite the lighter mood, Mark remained cautious. He understood that dismantling Richard's operation didn't mean the underlying issues were entirely resolved. Corruption thrived where transparency faltered, and complacency often paved the way for new tyrants to rise. To prevent history from repeating itself, he encouraged the community to adopt reforms aimed at fostering accountability and inclusivity. Residents formed a temporary committee to draft new guidelines for neighborhood governance, ensuring decisions were made democratically rather than dictated by a single authority figure. Mark played an advisory role in these discussions, offering suggestions based on principles of fairness and mutual respect. Rules are important, he said during one meeting, but so is understanding why they exist. We shouldn't enforce policies just because someone says we have to. They should make sense for everyone. His words resonated deeply, earning nods of agreement from those present. Slowly but surely, the foundation for a healthier, more equitable community began to take shape. As the months passed, signs of renewal became evident throughout the neighborhood. Lawns still needed mowing, mailboxes still required painting, and, yes, toys still occasionally cluttered porches. But instead of being sources of contention, these minor imperfections added charm and character to the area. Families decorated their homes with personalized touches. Wind chimes, flower beds, quirky garden gnomes that reflected their unique personalities. Even the dreaded HOA handbook, once a symbol of oppression, was rewritten collaboratively to reflect the values of the entire community. Life for Mark and Lily settled into a comfortable rhythm. Weekends were filled with trips to the park, movie nights, and family dinners. Mark continued working his day job, which allowed him to provide for Lily while keeping his past career firmly in the background. Yet, every so often, he couldn't help but marvel at how drastically things had changed. The man who had once trained elite operatives to dismantle hostile organizations now spent his evenings reading bedtime stories and helping Lily practice her multiplication tables. It was a stark contrast, but one that brought him immense joy. Still, Mark knew better than to let his guard down completely. Evil often lurked where least expected, and he remained vigilant, teaching Lily valuable lessons about safety, resilience, and standing up for what's right. If something doesn't feel fair, he told her one evening, tucking her into bed, speak up, and if you're not sure how, find someone who will listen. Together we can fix almost anything. Lily nodded sleepily, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. Like you fixed our neighborhood? She asked, her voice soft with admiration. Exactly, like that, Mark replied, kissing her forehead. Now get some rest, superhero in training. Tomorrow's another adventure. Outside, the night was calm, the stars twinkling brightly overhead. The neighborhood glowed with warm porch lights and the distant hum of friendly conversations. Gone were the days of intimidation and fear. In their place stood a community united by trust, cooperation, and hope for the future. Mark stepped onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. Yet as he gazed at the quiet streets bathed in moonlight, he couldn't shake the thought that somewhere out there, injustice still lingered. In other neighborhoods, other towns, other lives. He didn't wish for conflict, but he knew that if called upon again, he wouldn't hesitate to act. After all, protecting the innocent wasn't just his duty as a father, it was his calling as a man who had dedicated his life to destroying targets quietly, efficiently, and decisively. For now, however, peace reigned in their little corner of suburbia, and nothing made Mark happier than knowing that Lily could grow up surrounded by love, laughter, and neighbors who truly cared. As he closed the front door behind him, he smiled to himself, grateful for the simple joys of family, friendship, and freedom.